So I'm Mark Hausner. I'm an associate research professor in hydrology at the Desert Research Institute. And I'm going to be talking about mountain meadows in the Tahoe Basin and analyzing trends in those meadows using the Landsat archive and gridded meteorological data. I'm going to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Chris Pearson, Charles Morton, and Justin Huntington, who are all also with the Desert Research Institute. So mountain meadows are critical ecosystems that serve a range of functions. You see some of them listed here. And the really important thing about these meadows is that the effects of the ecosystem services that they provide are felt far beyond the meadow boundaries themselves. And so that makes them a real focus of management and a focus of conservation efforts. And so here, we're supporting TRPA's conservation and management efforts in the mountain meadows with a remote sensing analysis of Tahoe Basin meadows. And so this allows us to leverage both the temporal and spatial analytical capabilities of remote sensing to monitor meadow status and specifically changes over time in meadow status. And so using remote sensing data, we can identify temporal trends and variability over time. And we can also look at spatial homogeneity of meadows and the distribution, the spatial distribution of the greenness within meadows. To do this, we used the Landsat record. Landsat is a satellite mission that was initially launched in 1984. The current satellites have about a 30-meter pixel resolution. You get an overpass, you get an image every 8 to 16 days, and that imagery is freely available. And recent advances in cloud computing have made it much easier and much more efficient to process and analyze that entire record. And so we're making use of the entire Landsat record here. So to do this remote sensing analysis, the first thing that we're going to do is define our meadows. So TRPA provided us with 400 meadow polygons. And what we did is then look at those polygons and figure out how many of them we could actually analyze using the Landsat data set. So we got 315 meadows that were viable for analysis. And then we took each one of those polygons, we gave it a negative 15-meter buffer. And what that does is it ensures that our Landsat pixels, which are 30 meters, are capturing the meadow itself. That negative 15-meter buffer ensures that at least more than half of each pixel is going to be meadow. And then the next thing we did is rasterize those polygons to match the Landsat grid, and so that those meadows are defined along the pixel divisions in the Landsat data. Our analysis for this project focused on the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. An NDVI, at its most basic, is just a measure of the greenness of vegetation as a proxy for vegetation vigor. It makes use of two Landsat bands, the near infrared and the red band, and that process, that ratio of the difference versus the sum of those two bands, will tell us about the plant's function. Specifically, what we're going to be most interested in is the change in NDVI over time, because different plants express NDVI differently, but those changes are significant. So we used two different values of NDVI in this project. The first is just the observed NDVI, what we get out of the satellite data after we mask for bad points, so cloudy images, bad data. And the second is a climate-adjusted NDVI, and this follows some work by Christine Albano in 2020 that controls for the interannual climate variability of NDVI. And what you see in the adjusted NDVI signal is the change in NDVI over time after you've removed the effects of interannual climate variability. And our analysis process consisted of, first, looking at basin-wide trends in these NDVI values. Second, considering individual meadows in relation to those basin-wide trends, and we did this with percentile rankings. We looked at those individual meadows independently, and then we looked at the meadows considering their history as well. So the quantitative details of what we did was based on the annual late summer NDVI. So we obtained every August and September Landsat image. We got the spatially and temporally integrated NDVI, so we have one NDVI value for each year of record, 1984 to 2019, for each meadow. At the same time, we're looking at the standard deviation of pixels within that meadow, so we have one value of standard deviation for each meadow for each year that's covering the spatial variability of greenness. We took those annual data and we looked at temporal trends, so trends over time using non-parametric statistics, so the Mann-Kendall test for statistical significance, and the Thiel-Sen slope to calculate the magnitude of those changes over time. And then we looked at the root mean squared error around a temporal trend to give us the temporal variability of the greenness of the meadow itself. So the first thing that we did is look at basin-wide trends in Ndvi. And so this image here shows us the basin-wide average. And so you have the mean and the standard deviation for every meadow averaged together for the entire period of record. So again, 1984 to 2019. And what we see is a statistically significant increase in Ndvi of about 0.0025 per year. And this is similar to studies that we see across the globe from forested areas. And so there is research attributing this to rising temperature, rising levels of CO2 that better foster plant growth, a longer growing season, and a change in the timing and the length of growing season, as well as changes in the precipitation pattern. And so this is consistent with data from across the globe, and we're seeing that same thing happen in the basin itself. If we break that down a little bit, we can look at the trends in meadow Ndvi across different meadows. And so what you see here is that same trend, the basin-wide Ndvi trend, but we've got it plotted 5 times for each quantile, for different quantiles from the data set. And so we have the 90th percentile, 75th percentile, the median, 25th percentile, and the 10th percentile. And what we're seeing here is that overall increasing trend is uniform over all the different meadows. It's uniform over wet and dry meadows. It's uniform over healthy and degraded meadows. And so this is really a basin-wide trend that we're seeing everywhere. So that was the basin-wide trend in the observed Ndvi. What we have here is the basin-wide trend in the climate-adjusted Ndvi. And what you see is that you still have a trend remaining. The statistical significance goes down a little bit, so instead of being 99% confident in this trend, we're about 90% confident. And the magnitude of that trend changes. And so it goes from 0.0025 per year to 0.0018 per year. It falls a little bit. But what this indicates is that this rising trend is not completely explained by changes over time in the potential water deficit, the difference between precipitation and evapotranspiration, but there are other processes driving it. Those processes can be some of the ones that we talked about earlier, the changes in temperature, changes in growing season, but they could also be just changes in the meadows themselves. And so what we see here is basin-wide trends in spatial variability of the meadows. And so again, this is showing the standard deviation of the pixels within each given meadow over time. And what we're seeing here is that this is flat. The spatial variability of those meadows isn't changing. So even while the meadows are getting generally greener, the distribution of pixels in the meadows and the range, the variability of those pixels within each meadow remains pretty constant over time. So now we're going to take a look at a couple of individual meadows. And so the first one is shown here in 3 different plots. At the top, we have just the observed Ndvi over time. And so those blue dots are the observation, and the yellow line is the 5-year running average. And what you see here is that this Ndvi is remaining relatively constant over time. It's moving, bouncing up and down, but it's bouncing around a central tendency. But if you look at that middle plot, which gives you the percentile rank, where this meadow compares to other meadows in the basin, you can see a decline in that. And so the basin is greening while this meadow is staying the same, and it's essentially falling behind the other meadows in the basin. So that dashed red line indicates that the decline is statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. The other thing that we see in the bottom plot is the standard deviation of Ndvi. And so again, this is capturing the spatial variability within this meadow. And that standard deviation is increasing. So that might indicate that there's something going on in the meadow that's changing the distribution of water available to the plants themselves. And so what we see here is that we're going to say that this meadow is declining. It's declining in that percentile rank, and the increasing spatial variability is an indicator of a potential problem too. So we can contrast that with the plot on the right. On the right, you see that the observed Ndvi is increasing at a statistically significant rate. You can see from that middle plot that it's keeping pace with its percentile rank. It's remaining pretty constant there. And in that bottom plot, the spatial variability is falling, indicating that we are, as time goes by, that meadow is distributing water more and more evenly to the plants in that. And so what we see here is a stable, healthy meadow. So within those individual meadows, we could also look at the difference between observed and climate-adjusted Ndvi. And in particular, we're looking at which one has a greater root mean squared error around that temporal trend. So up at the top, we're looking at fallen leaf meadow. Fallen leaf is a relatively undisturbed, relatively pristine meadow. And what you see here is that the observed Ndvi residual, the root mean squared error, is much greater than the adjusted Ndvi residual. So when we remove the effective signal, the residual goes down. And what this is telling us is that interannual climate variability is driving the variability in the Ndvi at this meadow. The lower meadow is in Zephyr Cove, and so that is a much more urbanized, much more developed area. And here you see that the adjusted Ndvi residual is much greater than the observed Ndvi residual. And so once you remove the effect of climate, you're seeing a greater variability over time around that trend line. And so what this tells us is that this meadow is responding to stresses that are outside of interannual climate variability. One of the things that goes on in the Tahoe Basin is restoration work. And Cookhouse Meadow is an example of this. Cookhouse Meadow was restored 2005 to 2006. And what we see is that that restoration produces changes in that meadow record that aren't well represented by just a single trend line from 1984 to 2019. And so instead of looking at a trend line, we can analyze these meadows as pre and post restoration. So here's an example of that kind of analysis. On the left side, you have the pre-restoration slope, which is less than 0.001 per year. And so this is a relatively stable, not changing Ndvi in a basin that's greening. So this would be something that we would consider degrading. On the right side, we have that post-restoration slope, which is increasing at a rate of 0.006 per year, which is much greater than the rate of increase of the basin as a whole. And so that restoration is affecting the Ndvi as it moves forward through time, and it's improving as a result, or at least coincident with that restoration work. So I'm just going to recap what we've talked about here. This analysis lets us visualize and quantify trends in meadows over time. It lets us look at those trends in relation to the basin as a whole. So we can look at the basin as a whole, and we can look at individual meadows. And it gives us some historical context to look at in the meadows themselves. The last thing we can do then is look at the influence of climate variability and the relative influence of climate and other drivers on these meadows. It's really important to say that this is not a substitute for boots on the ground. This is a supplement, and it can go along with other monitoring processes to understand how meadows are changing over time. And that's how TRPA is using it. This is TRPA's meadow scoring scheme that they're using as a component of meadow surveys. And so as we go forward in time and we get more data from these meadows and we get more data from the other components of the surveys to compare to, we can refine this scheme and target it more for the specific management needs of TRPA going forward. So I want to wrap up with just a couple of acknowledgements. Thanks to Sean Tevlin from TRPA and Shana Gross from the Forest Service for their support and feedback over the course of the project. And to the Nevada Division of State Lands, Lake Tahoe License Plate Program for the project funding. And I hope that you will stick around for the Q&A that's starting in just a few minutes here.